Let's turn to our liturgy for tonight. This is a continuation of what we looked at last week, Jeremiah 31:31. We read the passage about how that God is promising to Israel that there's one day going to be a new covenant, a Brit Chadashah. And go back and listen to last week's study or follow my YouTube channel where I have the liturgy sections that are separated. In fact, if I go back over to my channel, you'll see, let's see, popular uploads, live internet studies. Let me click on videos for a second, and you can see it's right there. See the Hebrew and Greek Bible liturgy insights from Jeremiah 31:31 that I posted 6 days ago? That's the study that I'd like you to go back and listen to. So let's continue. We're basically, for the next 4 or 5 liturgy sections, we're going to work our way through Jeremiah 31 through 34. So we'll hit all 4 verses and their New Testament counterparts, which are Hebrews 8, verses 8, 9, 10, and 11 and 12. So those 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, those 5 verses out of the New Testament corresponding with the 4 verses out of the Old Testament, or out of the Tanakh. So we read verse 31 last week, the new covenant we're introducing, and we did a little mini word study on the word Chadashah. Go back and listen to that. Let's read now the verse 32 and talk about that. Continuing in this prophecy, Jeremiah says, "Not like the covenant that I made with their forefathers, or with their fathers, on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord." Okay, that's the English ESV. We're going to be looking tonight at this word covenant again. We already really looked at mostly at covenant, Brit Chadashah, or new, last week. But now let's look at the word covenant. Let's focus on that word. Let's jump over to the Hebrew on the right side of the page. The Hebrew says, "Lo chabrit asher karati et avotam b'yom hechezeki b'yadam lahotziam me'eretz Mitzrayim asher hema heferu et briti va'anochi ba'altivam ne'um Adonai." And the word for covenant that we're highlighting, right, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers, is right there in the Hebrew. Chabrit. It's really just that part right there. The word brit. And let's look at this just briefly. Strong's number 1285. Brit. Let me blow that up a little bit on your screen. And using the Hebrew Strong's Concordance, the definition simply says a covenant. Right? Like, well, what is a covenant? Well, a covenant is a covenant. Later on, when we get to the Strong's corresponding Greek number for the Greek word for covenant, diatheke, we're going to see that it's going to kind of flesh out a little bit more definitions. But basically, we can fill in using English words. Like if I were to take the word covenant there and pull up a... let's see if I can blow that up for you. I don't like that. Let's try like that. The word covenant in the word covenant, according to just a standard kind of dictionary definition, Google's definition, is a contract drawn up by deed. Synonyms include compact or treaty or pact or accord or deal or settlement, a guarantee, a promise, a bond. They go on to describe it as a clause in a contract, an agreement which brings about a relationship of commitment between God and His people. The Jewish faith, they say, is based on the biblical covenants made with Abraham, Moses, and David. So this is just a very kind of generic, all-purpose word that we could use to describe covenant. Obviously, from God's perspective, it's some type of promise that He's made between Himself and another party. But what's important for Israel is that God vocalizes or spells out or articulates the promises and the stipulations of his disagreement with Israel, and he puts it into writing, so that the covenant is not just God's spoken promised Israel, it now becomes a written declaration. It now becomes something that Israel can reference over and over again as they read the words in the pages, the outline of the covenant agreement. Okay, so having that as our starting point, let's launch now into Hebrews chapter 8. This is the longest continuing quote from the Tanakh, as I mentioned earlier. So let's pick up where we left off last week. We already looked at verse 8, where the writer to the book of Hebrews quotes Jeremiah 31:31, and we looked at the word new there, and we talked about how that when Jeremiah says that I'm going to make a new covenant with Israel, he could be invoking a renewal of an existing covenant, like the Mosaic covenant brought back into renewed purpose and a refreshed state of use, so that we could turn that term new into renewed. But given the nature of the rest of the promise about how the radical change of Israel from the inside out as a corporate people, it's better to understand that word new as in something that's never before happened. Indeed, when we finally sit back and look at this passage as a whole, this promise in Jeremiah 31 as well as Hebrews, we see that there's a significant part of the new covenant that has not taken place yet. It's still awaiting a future fulfillment. So it's so new that it hasn't even come out yet, right? It's still on the assembly line or wherever God has it. He's working it out. And yet, on the other hand, there's an aspect of new covenant that is available for anyone who places their genuine faith in the new covenant anchor, the new covenant founder, the new covenant guarantor, which we know, of course, to be Christ himself, Yeshua. So let's keep moving through this promise. We already read Hebrews chapter 8 last week. Let's now move on to Hebrews chapter 8, verse 9. The verse says, quote, "Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord." Now, if you didn't catch it, there are some minor variant wordings in the way the writer to the book of Hebrews quotes the passage, and there's one significant difference in the quote from Jeremiah that's carried over into the New Testament version here, the Greek version, which we will look at here momentarily. But first, let's read the Greek. Let's start here. The Greek says, "U kata tain diatheken hein epoiesa tois patrasin auton in hemera epalabamenu mu tes kairos auton." He continues, "Exagagen autus ek ges aiguptu hati autoi uk enemenon in te diatheke mu kago emelesa auton lege kurias." And that's the Greek rendering. Now, let's compare, just briefly before we continue to exegete, let's compare resources. Let's take the Greek rendering from Hebrews chapter 8, verse 9, and compare it against the Septuagint Greek rendering from Jeremiah 31:32. Remember, the Septuagint, the LXX, is the early Greek translation from the Masoretic Hebrew. It's one of the earliest translations of the Tanakh into a different language, and it showed up on the scene 200 or so years even prior to the times of the New Testament or the Gospel era or the times of Jesus and the apostles and things like that. So let's see what they have to say. First on my screen, what you see is a, don't want to do that. First, what you see is a kind of modified King James version from this website resource, greekdoc.com. And it reads the verse, "Not according to the covenant that I made with their I keep saying forefathers, I apologize, with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was husband unto them, says the Lord." And then once again, in the middle of the screen, we have the Hebrew once more, Loch Chabir Asher Karati et Avotam Bayom Hecheziki Bayadam Lahotziam Me'etz Mitzrayim Asher Hima Heferu et briti v'anochi ba'alti vam ne'um Adonai. But then significant for us is that we now have a rendering from the Greek, or from the Hebrew into Greek. And the Greek says, and it should sound very familiar, it should sound almost identical to the Greek New Testament we just read a moment ago, which some minor changes, but which I'll highlight here in a second. But let me read the Greek first. The Greek says, kata tain diathekein, hein diathemein, tois patrasin auton in himera epilabamenu mu, tes keros auton exagagain autus, ek geis aiguptu, hati autoi, uk enemenon in te diathekemu kai ego emelesa auton facen kurias. All right, and there's another Greek rendering right over to the very right of it. It's just the a different manuscript family, but as far as I can tell, it is almost word for word identical without any difference, even in case from the one we just read. So I don't have to read the Greek over on the right side of the page. It's the same.